Hi, I'm Tiffany Craig of Continuum Counseling Services in Columbia, Maryland, and this is your Mental Health Minute. Now, we're coming up on winter holidays, and whether you're a Christian or you're Jewish or you're Buddhist, or basically almost every faith tradition, pagan, even humanism, has a number of celebrations in the winter time that have to do with gathering together, with remembering. They're the kind of celebrations that mark our lives. So, that being the case, when somebody's experienced a loss, whether it was because someone in their lives has died or because they lost a life dream or a relationship, something significant has been lost in their lives, these kinds of touch points, holidays, life markers can be extremely painful and extremely difficult. And sometimes that discomfort shows up in very sort of unexpected ways, things that you didn't even necessarily recognize at first that are grief. So I thought it would be important to talk a little bit about holidays and grief. I'm going to cover this in two different sections. Section one is going to be just describing the grief process in a way that hopefully is a useful frame for people. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk about sneaky manifestations of grief, things you didn't necessarily recognize as grief, and we'll also talk about ways to take care of yourself. Okay, so when we think about grief, sometimes people think that we're only talking about sadness. And grief is so much more than just sadness. Basically, grief is not a feeling. Grief is a process. Grief is a process by which we learn to live our lives in a different way on the other side of a loss. So a lot of different frameworks, a lot of different ways that people look at grief. And in my years of counseling and experience, the most helpful frame I've ever heard comes from J. William Worden. He frames things in terms of tasks of grief. He identifies 4 different tasks of grief. And the reality is, when we're grieving, we're working all 4 tasks all at the same time. In fact, they tend to sort of propagate each other. So one task of grief is accepting the reality of the loss. That one's kind of a more obvious one, kind of dealing with, okay, yeah, it really is true. This person is no longer in my life, or I no longer have this marriage, or I no longer have this job or this career or this sense of who I am. Whatever that loss may be, accepting the reality of that loss is one of the important tasks in that process of learning to live your life in a new way on the other side of the loss. So another task that Worden brings up is adjusting to the new environment. And adjusting to the new environment, as you can imagine, then prompts you to think again about accepting the reality of the loss. So for instance, you have a holiday celebration and a certain person has always done a certain function on the holidays, and that person's not there. Accepting the reality of that is painful and difficult and challenging and can bring up anger and frustration and all kinds of feelings, some of which seem to make sense to you and some may not be immediately logical or, kind of hold together. But the other thing that's happening is you're put in a position where you have to adjust to the new environment because that person is not there. So you have to learn a new way to do things, which brings up those feelings of having to accept the reality of the loss all over again, and also harkens to another one of the grief tasks, which is working through the emotions of your grief. Often your loss will bring up someone else's losses, and then they'll be asking you questions or making placations or making oversimplified statements to try to make you feel better, to try to make it stop because they want to feel more comfortable. And so one of the hardest parts of grief, in my opinion, is helping to advocate for yourself, for what you do and don't need. You can accept the intention behind those who are caring clumsily for you, thank them for caring about you. And if you can, find a way to say, that's not really what I need right now. This idea, oh, he's in a better place. This is not helpful when you miss your loved one. Those kinds of things can feel very shallow and empty. So this is all part of working through the emotions that are connected to the loss, which of course puts you face to face also with adjusting to the new environment. The person who always did that function is no longer there, and I have to find a way to make peace with a new normal that I don't really want. And yet, God, I don't have a choice. One thing that's helpful in that process is sort of creating an ongoing connection with, if it's someone who's died, you create an ongoing connection with the deceased. If it's life lost, you create an ongoing connection with your former life so that it's now part of the fabric of who you are, that you give it a place of honor in your life story. That can look like any number of things, and I encourage you to be very creative in thinking about ways that you can honor this loss in your life in a new way. It's a little easier, I think, honestly, when someone's passed away, even when it's been a difficult death or an unexpected death or something awful like a suicide or a homicide. It's much, much more difficult. And at the same time, you also have a concrete person to grieve. So for instance, you can put that person's picture up. You can set a place at the table for that person. You can spend time talking about that person. And as brutally difficult as that can be, the concreteness of it sometimes is very helpful. It's difficult with life losses when you've lost, say, a marriage or a career, or say, you've lost some facility in your physical body due to illness, something like that. It can be a little bit more nebulous, a little bit more difficult to concretely give that former life a place of honor in your new life, in that new environment. For some people, that can be things like writing about your experiences or sharing your experiences publicly through public speaking. Anything that's going to meet the need for you. Your grief is going to be as unique as you are, so don't be surprised. And don't be surprised by the feelings that come. Another thing that's very specifically difficult at the holidays is because the holidays tend to be a time and a place where we gather together with other people, as if there are other people who may be grieving the same loss, but they're not you, and every loss is unique. So learning to grieve differently together is very difficult, particularly in families and in church families, in faith group families, where everyone's dealing with a loss, but it's a little unique, and different people will grieve differently at different times. There may be times in your grief that you need to not be around people, and you need people to understand that. There may be times when you need to talk, but the people you most want to talk with are people who are in a place where they need to retreat and take care of themselves. So it's a perpetual negotiation. Doing it well requires a great deal of respect and a great deal of thoughtfulness that is often difficult to come by when we're not feeling our best, because we're in a deep state of pain, confusion, anger, whatever it may be, due to the loss. And therefore, I think one of the most important things to hold on to while we're grieving together differently is grace. And by grace, I mean just understanding that we're all human. We all mess up pretty regularly. And understanding the human being in front of us who has done something that's hurtful to us, while it can be very painful, I think it's important when we're all grieving to recognize that that wasn't necessarily a malicious thing that the person did. And at some point, when it does feel okay for you and that person to talk about it, you probably need to talk about it and see if you can come to some place of peace and resolution together. But don't be surprised if your grief needs sometimes smash right into the grief needs of other people in an incompatible way. And at those times, we need to offer one another grace and love, and we need to offer ourselves grace and love. You need to be taking very good care of yourself. So that's our structure for grief, talking about holidays and grief. Again, the warden tasks are accepting the reality of the loss, working through the emotions of the loss, adjusting to the new environment on the other side of the loss, and creating an ongoing connection to either the deceased person or your former life. At times, it can be very helpful to talk to somebody outside of your family or outside of the loss, someone who is a professional like myself, who is trained to listen and to hear and to hold your feelings and your experience in a place of honor. I am happy to do that for you. Feel free to click on the Contact Tiffany button, and let's talk about ways that I can be useful to you. In the meantime, be gentle with yourself and take good care.